There's a lot of talk about how the Devastator isn't any good, they have low DPS, blah blah blah, but this class is actually a ton of fun, and I have an anomaly focused build for you today, focusing on using our Quake as our primary damage dealer, which is much more fun than pressing your rounds ability and holding left click. Let's go. This video is sponsored by my Twitter, where I'm actually giving away this bad boy right here. Jump over to my Twitter, have a look at the tweet, which is linked in the description down below if you would like to enter. So the deal with the Devastator, regardless of your build, is that there is no rounds ability, right? So you can't just press one button and your guns just become this uber powered ability that you can just melt everything with. You kind of got to get creative with how you're going to make this build. So something that I decided to focus on from the weapon perspective is making sure that I have high damage proc abilities on my weapons so that every time I do actually use them, they do deal a ton of quick damage. But our key focus in this build is on Anomaly Power and using Earthquake and Impale as our two primary damage dealers. That's where most of your damage is going to come from this build. The guns are really secondary to that. So we're using Quake with extra charges to just deal as much AoE damage as possible. And then while waiting for cooldowns, we are using our weapons, and basically you're just switching between the two weapons and proccing those big damage dealing things on them, like Storm Whip or Claymore or any of the other options that you can choose from, which we'll get into in a little bit. I did tinker around with using Golem instead of Impale as my other skill, but I ended up using Impale because I wanted to focus more on damage. That's a key issue that the Devastator does have, and this is a really good build to focus on trying to get golds with your expeditions. Without Impale, it makes it significantly harder. So I've used this build a lot to get golds and keep pushing up through the tiers. We've touched on it already, but let's get into the skills. Now, our primary skill is going to be Quake. That's our key ability. It's our key damage deal. It is an AoE ability that will not only interrupt, but deal a ton of damage in a kind of like a cone in front of you. You can buff this with various things, but this is going to be our primary skill. We also have Gravity Leap, which is basically just a distance closer. We're not really using it for anything else. We're not using any mods to buff this. Even just with having a high anomaly power, when you do use Gravity Leap, it does deal a decent amount of damage. So it's not the worst option ever. For our third skill, I highly suggest to go with Impale. Now, as I said, I tinkered with Golem. I do like using Golem, especially as a defensive ability. You can pick up a certain node in your class tree, which will buff your anomaly power, which means that your Quake will do more damage. Ultimately, what I found is that having Impale with the two charges and the insane amount of damage you can do with Impale trumps the fact of having this defensive ability. If you are trying to push tiers and you're struggling, especially in the early stages, you could go with Golem. It is a really good ability and just make that minor change in your class tree, but I personally prefer to go Impale just for the extra damage that you can do with this ability, and it's a guaranteed bleed, so why not use it? For our class tree, the Seismic Shifter line is really the key focus, but we are avoiding some of these bigger mods like Paladin, Anomaly Bullets, and Strong Arm of the Law because they don't really benefit the key direction that we're focusing on. The extra increase to class melee or our firepower, as well as our protection, we're not using any protection skills, they're not really beneficial for this build. So we're using those extra slots to put these points into things like the bleed duration, the bleed damage, as well as picking up these reduced cooldowns because we want to make sure that we can Quake and Impale as much as possible. For your gear, man, I have had terrible gear drops with this build and with this class, so I haven't got the best gear, but the key focus is on anomaly power, status power, because we want to buff our status power as it increases the damage done from your bleed, and we are going to be bleeding targets. So status power is second, and then the last is just your global cooldown. So anomaly power, status power, and cooldown reduction is the key focus. Close range damage doesn't really do a whole lot of benefit to us, so we don't want to focus too much on that. For your weapons, as mentioned, you can really do whatever you like. The key focus is on having these mods like Storm Whip or something like Claymore or Death Chains that deal a lot of damage in quick succession. It's a good idea to focus on realizing what these cooldowns are. So for Claymore, it's 4 seconds, and for Storm Whip, it's 2. So you can keep switching your weapons regularly and making sure that you are doing this damage as often as possible. Breaking down mods, one of the really interesting things about this build is that there are a lot of really good options and things that you can kind of tinker with and find out what works best for you. Really, starting off with Earthquake, there is some really key mods that you have to make this build work. One of them is Earth Legacy, which increases the skill range of your Earthquake by 60%. This is actually huge. Like, you can snipe people with Earthquake. It is fantastic to use. The second one is Extra Quake, which gives you an extra charge of Earthquake before it goes on cooldown. You can also get Blood Shock to inflict bleed on enemies damaged by this skill, and Ground Crush, which just increases the skill's damage by a flat increase. Make sure you are putting Ground Crush on the highest level piece of gear that you have, because that damage base level will increase with the higher tier that you do have. So make sure if you've got a piece that's slightly higher than the other pieces, put this mod on that piece. Now, if you do get lucky with legendary drops, which I absolutely have not with this build, then you can get the tier 3 second quake mod, which will give you an additional earthquake. So you've got 3 earthquakes that you can use. It's just another way to get some of that extra damage coming out. Now, to buff your Impale, you want to make sure you pick up Impaler so that you can activate it one more time before triggering the cooldown, as well as, if you have the extra slot, Spike Forest, so that you can target an additional target with your Impale. So when you do actually use it, you hit 2 targets with the extra charge. That means you can hit 4 targets. If you do have these slots available, you can pick up some of the other Impale mods like the Sharpened Spike, which actually will increase its damage significantly, but that's only if you've got the slots available. Some other mods that you should look at is Untamed Power, which is a skill that deals X amount of damage to enemies within a 5-meter radius of you, and it does deal this damage based on your anomaly power. As we are an anomaly power build, this will deal a ton of damage. I've found that this is one of my top damage dealers during combat, especially in creature expeditions, so it's a good idea to pick up this mod if you do have the slots available. Bloody Boost to deal extra damage to bleeded targets is also a good option, as well as something like Stand Tall to increase your anomaly power and your firepower, but we don't really care about that when you are outside of combat for 5 seconds. Just some other options that you can pick up. There are plenty of bleed mods and anomaly power buffing mods and different things that you can tinker with this build, so I do highly recommend that you do play around with the builds and the mods that you can play with here, and just have a look at the end screen after an expedition and see what your most damage dealers is. For some general tips for this build, one of the key things that I noticed that will save your life many times is that you can hold Gravity Leap in the air. While you're in the air, you are invincible. If you hold it long enough, you will initiate some health regen, and your cooldowns will keep going down, so you can get your Quake and your Impale off cooldown while you're in the air, then drop down and deal a decent amount of damage. If you don't actually use the leap when you're in the air, you get a cooldown that's like 2 seconds, so you can actually keep doing this if you don't actually pop the ability once you're in the air. You should be lining up your Quakes as much as possible and hitting as many enemies as possible. This is your primary damage dealer, and you want to focus on this as much as possible. If you do have the available mod slot, Phantom Dash is really powerful for this build, as it allows you to quickly reposition so that you can focus on hitting as many targets as possible, because you can like leap through enemies, whereas the normal roll you can't. So you can get through enemies, line up your Quake, and then bang, off you go. Because our anomaly power is so high, our melee is actually really good with this build, so you should be using it to finish off enemies if possible. It also does inflict bleed, which we do want to make sure we are inflicting bleed on targets as much as possible because of the benefits we get from our class tree. If you're looking for more Outriders content, why not check out my Trickster build, which is focusing on using bleed shotgunners, which is kind of similar to the Devastator. So if you like bleeding and you like dealing damage, the Trickster bleed build that I made is a good option for you there. Please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and on Twitch, where I stream 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, Australian night times. We're also doing a couple of YouTube streams as well, so jump in there and have a chat if you do want to learn more about this build. Thank you for watching this video. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.